Good afternoon, students. Today is Monday, 15 March 2021. This will be our final lecture before spring break. Technically, we're already on spring break. I'm running a little bit behind in my lectures, so we're going to be caught up after this one. The next lecture will be on the 23rd of March, which is 8 days from now. That will be a Tuesday, and we'll be back on track. I'll try to stay on track from now on. I don't like lecturing on Saturdays or Sundays or Mondays, so I'm going to try to get all my lecturing done for the week by Friday. And for your class, the lectures may be done by Thursday. I posted chapter 6 of Feldman's book on Canvas for you, I think yesterday. So try to find some time over spring break to read the first section or two of that chapter, just so that when you sit down to watch my lecture, you will have familiarized yourself with the topic. Okay, let's get back to it. Today's lecture won't take all that long because, as I may have told you, we're spending just 2 days on this topic, and we're covering only the first section of chapter 5, the chapter entitled Primitive Rule Utilitarianism. It was too much material for just 1 day. It's probably not enough for 2 days, so both lectures are a little bit short, maybe 40 or 45 minutes. So let's go back to where we were. Why would somebody have invented a new kind of utilitarianism, what we are calling rule utilitarianism? Well, as you may have guessed, many utilitarians are not happy with what we are calling act utilitarianism. In cases like the grandson and the punishment case, it looks like act utilitarianism gives the wrong results, and it makes people uncomfortable. In the promising case, as you recall, the grandson did a calculation, and it turned out that of all the actions that were available to him, the act of cutting up his grandfather and using the body for bait had the greatest expected net utility, the greatest net utility. And therefore, according to U sub 7, it was the right thing to do. Now, many utilitarians recoil in horror at that sort of outcome. They say, I think it's unacceptable to cut up the grandfather's body and use it for bait. Therefore, if any theory leads to that result, then the theory itself must be false or unacceptable. Think also about the punishment case we discussed. Feldman described a case in which framing and punishing an innocent person maximized net utility. And therefore, according to U sub 7, framing and punishing that person would be the right thing to do. Once again, many utilitarians recoil in horror at the very thought that someone who's innocent should be made to suffer simply to maximize overall utility or happiness. So the motivation behind rule utilitarianism is to avoid those unacceptable results. Rule utilitarians think that we should shift our focus from individual concrete acts to rules. So what we should do is set up or discover a number of rules, preferably rules that apply to every situation that we may find ourselves in. The rules should be selected solely because of their propensity to maximize utility. In other words, we choose the rules because if the rules are followed by everybody, there will be more utility produced than by following any other rule. So in our most recent lecture, you may recall I held up that colorful handout that's been posted on Canvas, and I walked you through in 2 different directions all of the boxes on that handout. And the purpose of that was to help you understand the structure of this theory that we're calling primitive rule utilitarianism. Instead of ranking the utility of individual acts, PRU, primitive rule utilitarianism, says that we should rank the conformance utility of various rules. And whichever rule has the highest conformance utility is called the correct rule. And the theory, therefore, says that the right thing to do is to perform whichever act prescribed is correct for that situation. Right? Follow whichever rule produces the greatest conformance utility. Okay, we can call that PRU for short, primitive rule utilitarianism. So the idea is that we're trying to formulate rules, and once we get the rules selected based upon their utility, then we simply follow the rules. So let's apply this theory to a couple of the difficult cases that we encountered earlier, starting with the promise case. Now, I suppose many of you, when you read that case about the grandson, had the following reaction. You may have thought that given especially the grandfather's benefiting the grandson and doing good for him, you would think that the grandson has a special duty to his grandfather to abide by his wishes. And his expressed wish was to be given a proper burial. And the grandson made a solemn promise to that effect. The grandson promised his grandfather that he would bury the body. Now, I suppose many of you would think that he should keep that promise, even if it doesn't maximize overall happiness. That's the reaction many people have. So suppose you have utilitarian leanings and you reject act utilitarianism. Maybe rule utilitarianism will produce the right result in the case like that. So let's see. What rule do you think would maximize utility if everyone followed it? Here are 4 possible rules that govern the same situation. In other words, they're alternative rules. Now, rule number 1, if you have made a promise, then keep it. Rule number 2, if you have made a promise, then break it. Rule number 3, if you have made a promise, then do whatever you feel like doing. And what about rule number 4? Let's leave 4 aside for a moment. I'm going to come back to 4 in a moment, but we've got 3 rules on the table right now, and I can make my point with those 3. Of those 3 rules, which rule of those 3 do you think would maximize overall utility if everyone followed it, if everyone obeyed that rule, if everyone conformed to that rule? I would guess, and maybe you would too, that the rule, if you have made a promise, then keep it, would maximize overall happiness if everyone conformed to it. And you can understand why. Because when people have promises made to them, they come to rely on those promises. And in reliance on the promise being kept, they make further plans. So that if the promise is broken, all of their plans come crumbling down. And that causes lots of dolors in the form of disappointment, frustration, grief, even anger. And it may cost people money, which is a form of dolor that contributes to people's unhappiness. So, in general, keeping promises tends to maximize overall utility. So, of the 3 rules that we have just discussed, in all likelihood, the one that says, if you have made a promise, then keep it, is the rule that if everyone followed it, would maximize overall happiness. It is therefore the correct rule for its situation. And since the theory that we're considering, PRU, says that an act is right if and only if it is prescribed by the correct moral rule for its situation, it would imply that in the grandson case, he ought to keep his promise. And for many utilitarians, that's the right result. So rule utilitarians say, voila, we have found a theory that is utilitarian because its goal is to maximize utility or happiness, and it gives the right result in cases where act utilitarianism gives the wrong result. And by right result, I mean the result that seems right intuitively. And by wrong result, I mean the result that seems wrong intuitively, where intuitively means based upon your spontaneous gut reaction to hearing the facts of the case. So here we have what appears to be a single fact situation or single example where act utilitarianism has one result and rule utilitarianism has another result. And many utilitarians think that the rule utilitarian theory gives the correct result and act utilitarianism gives the wrong result. If that's true, then that would be a reason to prefer rule utilitarianism to act utilitarianism. Remember, the main motivation for rule utilitarianism is to avoid the problems with act utilitarianism. And what if it turned out that rule utilitarianism did not, in fact, provide better results than act utilitarianism? Then presumably we would not go over to it. We would stick with the original version, which is act utilitarianism. So rule utilitarianism should be accepted only if it really is superior to act utilitarianism. Now before we leave this topic, let's talk about the second case, the punishment case. Now there are various rules that we can imagine in that case. One rule might be something like this. Whenever you're in a position to frame an innocent person, do so. Another rule is whenever you're in a position to frame an innocent person, do not do it. And there are lots of other possibilities. Whenever you're in a position to frame an innocent person, do whatever you feel like doing. Once again, I would suspect that the rule that says when you're in a position to frame an innocent person, don't do it, that rule would produce more overall happiness than any other alternative rule. And if that's the case, as it seems to be, then it would be wrong in the case we discussed for the sheriff and the mayor and other public officials to frame and punish the innocent person. Why? Because it would go against the rule. It would go against the utility maximizing rule. And once again, it looks like rule utilitarianism is giving us the correct result, the one that conforms to our gut feelings, and act utilitarianism is giving us the incorrect result, the one that goes against our gut feelings. So if you applied this reasoning to all the other cases that posed a problem for act utilitarianism, remember the justice objection, the supererogation objection, rule utilitarianism consistently gives the correct results, whereas act utilitarianism consistently gives the wrong results. So that's the case for rule utilitarianism, right there. It's the form of utilitarianism which makes utilitarians happy, but it avoids many of the problems that afflict or confront act utilitarianism. Now, let's turn to some problems with this theory. I'll mention a couple. First of all, it has been argued by act utilitarians that rule utilitarianism collapses into act utilitarianism. Okay, that's the technical way to put it. Rule utilitarianism, which remember was supposed to be an improvement on act utilitarianism. In fact, according to the act utilitarians, rule utilitarianism has no advantages whatsoever. It collapses into act utilitarianism. In other words, it's just another form of act utilitarianism. So let me try to explain to you why that would be. Feldman has a pretty good explanation. I'm just supplementing his. I'm repeating some of what he says, adding some new things, and I'm sometimes saying what he says in a different way in the hope that it will get through to you. Now, let's go back to our promising case. Remember, I started giving you a fourth rule, and then I backed off and said, let's just stick with the first three. Let me introduce a fourth rule, and I'm going to repeat all four of them. Number one, if you have made a promise, then keep it. If you have made a promise, then break it. If you have made a promise, then do whatever you feel like doing. Now here's the fourth rule. Listen carefully. If you have made a promise, then do whatever maximizes net utility. That's a rule. It's an alternative to the other three. What that means is that it governs the same situation as the other three. What is that situation? The situation is if you have made a promise. That part stays the same in all four rules. The only part that differs is the consequent of the conditional, which is what prescribes the action. Keep the promise, break the promise, do whatever you feel like doing, or maximize net utility. Now, let's back up, take a deep breath. Of those four rules, which are alternatives to one another, which one, if followed by everyone, would maximize overall utility? Well, guess what? It's rule number 4. Now, why is that? Why does the fourth rule, the one that says do whatever maximizes net utility, why does that rule, if followed by everyone, maximize net utility? Because it tells you explicitly to do just that. It tells you in cases like the grandson, it says that the grandson should cut up the body and use it for bait, which means breaking the promise. But in the vast majority of cases where promise keeping maximizes net utility, that rule would tell you to keep the promise. So that fourth rule that we just discussed is perfect. It covers the cases where promise keeping maximizes utility, and it covers those rare, exceptional cases where promise breaking maximizes utility. It's ingenious, isn't it? And here's the thing. For every situation that you may find yourself in, you can formulate a rule that says, if you are in this particular situation, comma, then do whatever maximizes net utility. And if every situation has a rule like that, and if that's the rule that maximizes net utility, if everyone conformed to it, then for every situation, the right thing to do would be what? Maximizing net utility. And that's just another way of stating act utilitarianism, isn't it? And that's what the critics of rule utilitarianism say in reply to this new theory, rule utilitarianism. They say it's not really an improvement. It may have seemed to be an improvement, but really it reduces to act utilitarianism. It's equivalent to act utilitarianism. Specifically, it's extensionally equivalent. Okay? There are different kinds of equivalence. And we don't need to go into all of the types or even any other type. All we need is this one type. It's called extensional. Let me spell it. E-X-T-I-O-N-A-L. Extensional equivalence. And what that means is very simply this. In every case where rule utilitarianism says that a particular act is right, it will come out right on act utilitarianism as well. In every case where rule utilitarianism implies that a particular act is wrong, that act will come out wrong on act utilitarianism as well. In other words, the theories produce equivalent, identical results in all cases for the reasons I explained a moment ago. The reason is you can always formulate a rule for any situation that says when you're in that situation, maximize net utility. So if rule utilitarianism was intended to be an improvement over act utilitarianism, according to this objection, it fails. It does not constitute an improvement. It's no better and no worse than act utilitarianism. Now, what's the upshot of this? If you are an act utilitarian already, then your conclusion will simply be this. Abandon rule utilitarianism and come home, right? Leave that newfangled theory behind, that one called rule utilitarianism. Come home to act utilitarianism, because that's where you lived before you went off on your own to find this new theory. Now that you realize that the new theory, rule utilitarianism, is no improvement over the old one, act utilitarianism, then give up the rule utilitarianism and come home and resume being an act utilitarian. So that's the conclusion drawn by the act utilitarianism. Give up rule utilitarianism and come back home to act utilitarianism. Now, other people who are not utilitarians draw a different conclusion from this argument. Here's what they say. They think that act utilitarianism is unacceptable for lots of reasons that we've examined. It has all kinds of problems. If act utilitarianism is unacceptable, notice I said if act utilitarianism is unacceptable, then since rule utilitarianism is extensionally equivalent to it, rule utilitarianism is unacceptable as well. You see the reasoning? What it says is that since act utilitarianism is unacceptable, so is rule utilitarianism because they are equivalent. They produce exactly the same results. So in any case where act utilitarianism produced the wrong result, so would rule utilitarianism. So you need to keep in mind, Feldman doesn't emphasize this enough, I think, that the conclusion of this argument depends on whether the person in question is an act utilitarian or a non-utilitarian. Okay? They draw different conclusions from this objection. We can call this the extensional equivalence objection to rule utilitarianism. And once again, the act utilitarian draws the conclusion that the rule utilitarian should give it up and come home and become an act utilitarian. The non-utilitarian, someone who's not a utilitarian at all, draws a different conclusion. That person says act utilitarianism is unacceptable or false, and since rule utilitarianism produces exactly the same results as it, then rule utilitarianism is unacceptable or false as well. So the non-utilitarian thinks that this argument wipes out both kinds of utilitarianism. The act utilitarian thinks that this argument wipes out only rule utilitarianism, but doesn't touch act utilitarianism. Okay, really I have one more topic to discuss with you today. It's another argument that has been made by an act utilitarian. It's someone I've mentioned in this class before. You may remember the name. The man is John Jameson Carswell Smart. He has 4 names. He shortens it to JJC Smart. And I've heard that his friends and family called him Jack Smart. He was, in my opinion, a very great philosopher. He lived from 1920 until, I think, 2012. He lived into his 90s. He died a few years ago, in the past 10 years or so. Jack Smart was an act utilitarian. And he objected, naturally, to rule utilitarianism. And his objection was different from the one we just went over, the one that makes reference to equivalence. Here's what Jack Smart said. Jack Smart said, rules are fine. Even an act utilitarian can make use of rules. And I hope you remember that when we discussed John Stuart Mill, Mill himself endorsed rules. But remember that for Mill, those rules were rules of thumb only. A rule of thumb is just a handy, useful rule. It has no intrinsic merit. It's simply useful, like a paperweight. A rock can serve as a paperweight. The rock, we can assume, has no intrinsic value. It's not valuable in and of itself. It's not valuable for its own sake. But if that rock can hold your papers down and keep them from blowing away, then we would say that rock has certain value. Right? It's valuable as a means to an end. It's not valuable as an end in itself. What an act utilitarian says is that rules, or rules of thumb, are valuable not for their own sake, not as ends in themselves. They're valuable as means. A rule is a handy and useful thing, especially when you're in a situation where you can't conduct a calculation, a Benthamite utility calculation. Remember that baby carriage example where events are unfolding in real time very quickly? If you stop to do a calculation to figure out what to do, it would be too late. The baby would already be killed by the cement truck before you even acted. So to an act utilitarian, you should perform a calculation only when you have the time to do so. If you don't have the time to do so, you should fall back on various rules of thumb. And presumably one of those rules would be intervene to protect babies from danger. So when you realize what's happening in that case, you simply act in accordance with your rule. You run out, grab the baby, and get the baby out of the road. Right? You didn't need to do a calculation because you already had in hand a rule that most of the time produces the greatest amount of happiness. So my point right now is this. Even an act utilitarian like John Stuart Mill can endorse rules. And Jack Smart does as well. Smart says rules are wonderful things. And Smart says, I act on the basis of rules every day, all the time. Even though I'm a utilitarian and my goal is to maximize rules, I make use of rules. They're handy, right? Now, Smart goes on to say that if you have the luxury of time and can do a calculation, then you should do it. And if that calculation leads you to something like cutting up your grandfather's body and using it for bait, and if it seems to you pretty clear that that act would be the one that maximizes utility, then as a utilitarian, that's the act you must perform. It's obligatory. It's not merely discretionary. It's obligatory because you would be doing less than the best if you performed any other act. You would be leaving utility out lying on the table, so to speak. A utilitarian wants to squeeze out every drop of utility at all times. I like to use the metaphor. Suppose you've got a washcloth and it's soaking wet. What do you do when you want to throw it in the hamper? Like me, you wouldn't want to throw the washcloth into the hamper when it's soaking wet. The water will drip down and may ruin it. It may get on other items of clothing. Maybe it'll leak through the container. So what do? You wring it out into the sink. So you take the washcloth and you wring it, right? And get as much water out of it as you can. And then when it's as dry as you can get it, you throw it in the hamper. Well, that's the metaphor for utilitarianism. To a utilitarian, you are to squeeze every drop of utility out of each action that you perform on any occasion. So if you had a choice between producing 10 net units of utility and 9.5, you should produce 10. Why would you leave half a unit of utility lying on the table? Right? Squeeze it. Get every last drop of the utility that you can out of the act. So Smart says that if you know that a particular rule, let me say that again. Smart says if you know, because you've done a calculation, that breaking a particular rule will maximize net utility, then you are obligated to break the rule. And so the grandson may well believe that in general, keeping promises maximizes utility. But the grandson also realizes that he's in a very, very strange, weird, bizarre, unusual situation. What makes it bizarre? Remember the features? One thing that makes it bizarre is that he's on a desert island. He and his grandfather were the only people there, and his grandfather has died. And if he breaks the promise to his grandfather, he knows that no one will ever find out about it, so it won't have the effect of undermining the institution of promising. It won't weaken people's propensity to keep their promises at all, because there are no people there. And if he ever makes it back to civilization, it's up to him not whether to tell anyone what he did. Right? He may keep it to himself, or if he's asked, he could lie and say that I buried my grandfather instead of admitting the truth of what he did. So the grandson is in a very unusual situation, and Smart would say to him, young man, if you really are a utilitarian, if your goal really is to make the world as happy a place as you can, taking everyone into account and counting everyone's happiness equally, then even though keeping promises most of the time maximizes net utility, you know full well that in this situation you're in right now, keeping the promise would not do that. So you need to break the promise. You must break the promise, morally speaking, and cut up your grandfather's body and use it for bait, because that's the act that would promote the greatest utility. And as a utilitarian, that's what the grandson wants. Now let's go back to the framing the innocent case, because we can make the same analysis. The problem in that case, from the point of view of a rule utilitarian, is that act utilitarianism seemed to give the wrong result. And that's why the rule utilitarian wanted to move to rule utilitarianism, to avoid that unacceptable result. Now, what Smart would say in that case to the police chief is this. Smart would say, ordinarily, not framing innocent people is the way to maximize net utility. Not framing the innocent, and therefore not punishing the innocent. But in a strange, weird, bizarre case like you find yourself in, the way to maximize utility is to frame and punish an innocent person. And therefore, you're obligated to do so if you're a utilitarian. So Smart thinks that rules should be kept when doing so maximizes overall utility, and that rules should be broken when doing so maximizes overall utility. In other words, the rules are dispensable. The rules are handy and useful, but that doesn't mean we should stick with them when we know that breaking them will maximize overall utility. Now, Smart coined a term for this. Smart claimed that rule utilitarians engage in what he called rule worship. Rule worship. And when Smart used that term, he meant it in a disparaging way. Now let's unpack it. I think Smart is suggesting that even if some things are worthy of our worship, following rules is not. Rules themselves are not worthy of our worship. If there's a God, maybe God is worthy of worship, but rules are not. Rules are not that sort of thing. They are handy and useful, yes, but should we stick to a rule when we know that breaking it will produce the greatest happiness? Smart's answer is, of course not. Anybody who advocates sticking to a rule when breaking it would maximize utility must be worshiping the rule. And that's superstitious. Right? You don't worship stones or bricks or leaves of grass. That's silly and foolish. You shouldn't worship rules either. That gives them a status that exceeds what they're worth or what they're due. Okay, it's a form of superstition. In fact, Smart goes on to say it's a form of irrationality. Right? If you follow a rule, if you're a utilitarian and you follow a rule, even when you know that doing so will not maximize overall utility, then you're being irrational. It's that simple. You're worshiping something that's unworthy of worship, namely a rule. Now, let me tell you a funny story. I told you the other day that I was asked to write an encyclopedia entry on SMART, and it's for an encyclopedia of utilitarianism. So even though SMART wrote about a large number of topics, my objective was to focus on his works in ethics, and specifically his writings on utilitarianism. And I may have told you that it took me a long time to A, gather up all of his writings, books and articles, B, read them slowly and carefully, C, analyze them carefully, 4, synthesize them, 5, write my article or my entry, and then of course revise it for publication. That process took me about a year, believe it or not. To write a 5 or 6 page encyclopedia entry took about a year. It was a lot of work, but it was very rewarding. I enjoyed it immensely because it gave me an excuse to read everything SMART had written about utilitarianism and ethics in general, and I learned a lot along the way. If you'd like, I'll post that entry. I'll try to remember when I get done lecturing today. I'll post that entry for you if you want to read it. It's only a few pages long. At any rate, when I was doing the research for that encyclopedia entry, I discovered something amusing. And here's how it goes. In a particular article back in the 1950s, SMART accused rule utilitarians of engaging in rule worship. Okay? Rule worship. A year or so later, when he published his next article, he apologized for doing that. He had qualms about it. He said something like this. He said, I shouldn't have used a disparaging term to refer to my fellow utilitarians as rule worshipers, and I vow to do better. In effect, he said, I won't do it anymore. I shouldn't have done it, and I won't do it anymore. Well, guess what? Within a year or two, in his next article, he was back to calling rule utilitarians rule worshipers. It's as though the devil made him do it. He couldn't resist the temptation. SMART has a love-hate relationship with rule utilitarians. On the one hand, they are utilitarians, and in his view, their hearts are in the right place. Right? Their goal is the same as his, which is to maximize net utility in the world, to make the world as happy a place as possible. So that part of their theory he likes. He just objects to their focus on rules. They just give them too much emphasis. They worship them, and rules are not worthy of anybody's worship. So SMART loves one thing about rule utilitarians, but he hates something else. He wishes they would come home. Come on home, my rule utilitarian friends. Come back to act utilitarianism that nurtured you. There's a home here. You'll be welcomed back. Okay, I'm getting a little silly. That's enough for today. We've covered the first section of this chapter. Remember, this is called primitive rule utilitarianism. And Feldman is correct when he says that probably nobody out there holds this particular version of rule utilitarianism. Why then did he discuss it if nobody holds this version? Because it's fairly simple for students to understand. Let me tell you that there have been more sophisticated versions of rule utilitarianism put forward by people like Richard Brandt and Brad Hooker. Brad Hooker calls his theory rule consequentialism instead of rule utilitarianism. So there are today people like Hooker and Brandt, although Brandt died a few years ago. There are people who are either alive now or recently were alive who believed that rule utilitarianism is a superior theory, superior to act utilitarianism. They take issue with SMART. They say that they're not worshiping rules at all. They think that rules are important and that we should follow them even when we believe that breaking them would maximize overall utility. Okay? Let me make one more comment about that because that's an important point. why would you follow a rule even when you know or suspect that breaking it would maximize utility? One answer is this: because you never really know for sure that breaking the rule will maximize utility. It's a gamble. And maybe you shouldn't gamble. Maybe you should stick with the rule and follow the rule because you're not sure whether breaking the rule will maximize utility. It's more likely that following the rule will maximize utility than that breaking the rule will maximize utility. So it has to do with our knowledge. The argument is something like this: we can never know for sure whether breaking a rule would maximize utility. So it's safer to stick with the rule and follow the rule. So it appeals to our ignorance, right? Epistemically, we can never know whether breaking the rule will maximize utility. So to be safe, we should simply follow the rule. Okay? Also, it has been argued that rules are simple. Many rules are simple, easy to learn, easy to teach, and easy to remember, and also easy to apply. And you can imagine a parent who is a rule utilitarian teaching a child various rules. Keep your promises, tell the truth, refrain from harming other people. If you're in a position to help someone at very little cost to yourself, you should do so. So there are all kinds of useful rules that a parent might teach a child, and might even teach the child, don't make exceptions to the rules. You're much safer and more likely to do the right thing if you follow the rule without doing a calculation. So rule utilitarianism has its defenders today. I just want you to be aware of that. Do they hold PRU? No. That's a simplistic, it's not just simple, it's simplistic. It's primitive. But philosophers have developed much more sophisticated theories. And I would say that the debate today is pretty robust and lively. You still have act utilitarians today, you still have rule utilitarians, and they go at each other. Sometimes they join up against non-utilitarians. It's interesting. The literature of ethics has people going after different groups, right? So if you're an act utilitarian, you're sometimes arguing against rule utilitarians. That's like a squabble within a family, right? Family members have differences, and they sometimes get into arguments and even fights. Sometimes act utilitarians find themselves fighting with non-utilitarians, egoists, or Kantians, or contractarians. So if you're an ethical theorist, sometimes you're fighting within the family, and sometimes you're fighting outside the family. And that's what makes it such a lively branch of philosophy. It's something I have loved for many decades now, from the time I was an undergraduate student and was first exposed to these theories. I've been reading about them, thinking about them, teaching about them, and it's immensely interesting to me. So that's enough on rule utilitarianism. Have a great spring break for the rest of the break. I hope you find time to watch these videos before you go back and read, let's say, the first section or two of the egoism chapter, which is posted, before you watch my next video. The next video will be on egoism. In fact, if you look at the reading list, you'll see that specifically the section that we'll be covering in our next lecture will be, what is egoism? Okay, so read that section before you watch the next video. Again, have a great day and a great spring break, and I'll see you back on the screen in a few days, a little over a week.